The blood-red sun dipped below the horizon as Margaret Fitzgerald collapsed in the dust outside the doctor's office, her hands clutching a crumpled piece of paper that had just changed everything. The year was 1879, and the Arizona Territory town of Copper Springs had never felt more desolate despite its recent boom from the nearby mining operations. Her tears carved clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks, and she didn't hear the approaching footsteps until a shadow fell across her hunched form. "Miss Fitzgerald, Margaret," the voice belonged to Declan Samuels, his worn boots coming to a stop before her. "What's happened?" Margaret couldn't speak, only sobbing harder as she thrust the doctor's note toward him. Declan crouched beside her, his tall frame folding awkwardly, spurs jingling as he settled. His calloused fingers took the note gently, eyes scanning the doctor's precise handwriting. "Consumption," he read aloud, his voice dropping to a whisper. 6 months. 6 months, she echoed, finally finding her voice. 6 months to live, that's all I have." Declan's weathered face, tanned from years under the western sun, tightened with emotion. His blue eyes, usually twinkling with mischief, were now serious as he looked at the 23-year-old schoolteacher who had come west only a year prior with dreams of independence and adventure. "Margaret," he said firmly, taking her trembling hands in his, "look at me." She raised her tear-stained face to his, seeing not pity but determination in his expression. "We'll live the life we still can," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion flickering in his eyes. "Every day, starting now. But what's the point?" she whispered. "I came west to build a life, and now we make sure it's a life worth living," Declan interrupted, pulling her to her feet with gentle insistence. "Every day of it." Margaret stood shakily, not understanding why this man, whom she knew only through brief encounters when he delivered mail from neighboring towns, would care so much about her fate. "Why would you help me?" she asked, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Declan's gaze softened. "Because no one should face this alone, and because," he hesitated, looking away briefly before meeting her eyes again. "Because I've watched you since you came to town. Your kindness with the children, your bravery in coming west alone, you deserve better than to give up now." The evening breeze picked up, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had fled Boston and a suffocating future of arranged marriage to find independence. She would not surrender to despair now. "What did you have in mind?" she asked, curiosity momentarily overcoming her grief. Declan smiled, a slow, genuine curve of his lips. "First, I'm getting you home before you catch a chill. Then tomorrow I'll show you what living really means in the West." He offered his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow. At 28, Declan Samuels was known throughout the territory as a reliable courier who could navigate the dangerous trails better than any man alive. What Margaret didn't know was that his interest in her went far beyond casual concern. The walk to Margaret's small cabin on the edge of town was quiet, punctuated only by the distant piano music from the saloon and the occasional call of a night bird. Declan left her at her door with a promise to return at dawn, and Margaret watched his retreating form until darkness swallowed him. Inside her sparse but tidy home, Margaret lit a lamp and sank into her rocking chair, the doctor's prognosis still echoing in her mind. Consumption had taken her mother years ago, and she recognized the symptoms: the persistent cough, the blood-flecked handkerchiefs, the growing weakness. She had hoped the dry desert air would help, but apparently she had arrived too late. 6 months, she whispered to the empty room, trying to grasp what it meant. Half a school year. Christmas would come, but not spring. She would never see her students graduate, never marry, never have children of her own. The injustice of it burned in her throat, and fresh tears threatened. But something else burned alongside her grief: Declan's words. "We'll live the life we still can." Was it possible to find meaning in such a short time? Could she pack a lifetime into half a year? Dawn arrived with a gentle knock on her door. Margaret, who had barely slept, answered it to find Declan astride a chestnut mare, leading a second, gentler-looking horse. "Miss Fitzgerald," he greeted, removing his hat, his hair the color of sun-bleached wheat, ruffled in the morning breeze. "Are you ready for your first adventure?" Despite herself, Margaret smiled. "You were serious." "I'm always serious about promises," he replied, his expression earnest. "I've packed food and blankets, thought we'd ride to Rainbow Canyon. It's about the most beautiful thing you'll see in this territory." Margaret hesitated. "I have school. I spoke with Mayor Jenkins last night," Declan interrupted gently. "He's arranging a substitute, said you should take some time." The realization that the mayor now knew about her condition sent a flash of embarrassment through her. "Does everyone know?" she asked, her voice small. Declan shook his head quickly. "No, madam. I told him only that you needed some personal time. Your business is your own to share." Relief washed over her, followed by gratitude. "Give me 10 minutes to change." True to her word, Margaret emerged in her riding skirt, a practical garment she'd adopted since coming west. Her auburn hair was pinned neatly beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and she carried a small satchel with essential items. Declan helped her mount the paint mare, his hands strong and sure at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through Margaret that she quickly attributed to her condition. They rode east, away from town, the desert landscape gradually giving way to scrub brush and eventually to the red rock formations that Arizona was known for. Declan proved to be a knowledgeable guide, pointing out medicinal plants and telling stories of the indigenous people who had inhabited the land for generations. "How do you know so much?" Margaret asked as they stopped to rest the horses in a small copse of mesquite trees. Declan handed her a canteen before answering. "Spent a lot of time with the Apache when I first came west. They taught me how to survive out here, how to respect the land." "Is that why you became a courier?" He nodded, looking thoughtful. "Seemed a good way to use the skills. Pays decent and I get to be my own boss. No one telling me what to do or where to be except the mail schedule." "Freedom," Margaret said softly, understanding completely. "Exactly." Declan studied her face. "That's what you came west for too, isn't it?" Margaret looked away, watching an eagle circle high above. "Yes. My father died 2 years ago, and my uncle arranged a marriage to his business partner, a man 30 years my senior. I took my inheritance and fled instead." "Brave woman," Declan commented, no judgment in his tone. "Foolish, perhaps," she replied with a sad smile, "given how things turned out." Declan moved closer, his gaze intense. "No, never foolish. You chose your own path. That's more than most do with a full lifetime." Margaret felt tears threatening again, but fought them back. She'd cried enough. "Thank you for this, Declan, for giving me something besides my diagnosis to think about." "We're just getting started," he promised, helping her back onto her horse. "The canyon's just ahead." Rainbow Canyon earned its name from the striations of color in the rock bands of red, orange, yellow, and even purple that seemed to change with the angle of the sun. Margaret gasped when they crested the final rise and the full panorama spread before them. "It's magnificent," she breathed, sliding from her horse to stand at the canyon's edge. "Worth the ride?" Declan asked, coming to stand beside her. "Worth everything," she answered honestly. In that moment, the weight of her diagnosis lifted slightly. She was alive now, standing in a place of breathtaking beauty with a man who seemed determined to help her make the most of her remaining time. They spent the day exploring the canyon rim, Declan showing her hidden petroglyphs and telling stories of the region's history. As the sun began to set, he built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans, jerky, and surprisingly good coffee. "Will we ride back tonight?" Margaret asked, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Declan shook his head. "Thought we'd camp if that's all right with you." "Return tomorrow. There's nothing quite like dawn over the canyon." Under normal circumstances, Margaret would have been scandalized by the suggestion of spending a night unchaperoned with a man she barely knew. But these weren't normal circumstances, and social conventions suddenly seemed trivial against the backdrop of her shortened life. "I'd like that," she agreed. Declan spread blankets on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance that Margaret found both comforting and, oddly, a little disappointing. As they lay beneath the vast canopy of stars, Conversation flowed easily between them. "Tell me about your life before Arizona," Margaret requested, watching sparks rise from the fire into the night sky. Declan was quiet for so long that she thought he might have fallen asleep. "Illinois," he finally said. "Farm country. My father worked us from sunup to sundown. 5 boys, and I was the middle one, never quite good enough, never quite strong enough, according to him." "Is that why you left?" "Partly." His voice took on a haunted quality. "Civil War changed everything. My older brothers never came home. Father blamed me for not going too, though I was only 14 when it ended. Said I should have lied about my age, done my duty." "That's terrible," Margaret said softly. "Left when I was 18. Worked cattle drives for a while, then found my way out here." He turned to look at her across the fire. "What about you? What was Boston like?" Margaret smiled at the memory of her hometown. "Proper. Everything had rules. The right dress, the right words, the right friends, but I loved the libraries, the lectures. I wanted to be a writer, actually." "Why didn't you?" "My father said it wasn't a suitable occupation for a woman of my standing." She sighed. "Teaching was the compromise, at least it involved books." "You could still write," Declan suggested. "I'd read your stories." The simple encouragement warmed Margaret more than the fire. "Maybe I will." They fell silent, the crackling flames and distant howl of coyotes the only sounds. Eventually, Margaret's eyes grew heavy, and she drifted to sleep with the strange but comforting knowledge that Declan was watching over her. Dawn painted the canyon in ethereal light, just as Declan had promised. Margaret woke to the aroma of fresh coffee and found him already up, preparing a simple breakfast. "Good morning," he greeted, his smile genuine. "Sleep well." "Better than I have in weeks," she admitted, surprised by the truth of it. Her usual nighttime coughing had been minimal, perhaps due to the dry air or simple exhaustion from the day's activities. They ate in companionable silence, watching the sun gradually illuminate the canyon depths. Margaret felt a pang of regret when Declan began packing their belongings for the return journey. "Must we go back?" she asked impulsively. Declan paused, studying her face. "Not right away if you don't want to, but I have mail to deliver tomorrow." He hesitated, then added, "You could come with me, see more of the territory." The offer was tempting. "What about my students? From what I hear, Miss Watson is a capable substitute, and with all due respect, Margaret, you've got 6 months. The children have years ahead of them." His bluntness was refreshing rather than hurtful. "You're right," she acknowledged. "Where does your route take you?" "North to Flagstaff, then a circuit through some of the smaller settlements and ranches. 3 days, usually." "I've never been to Flagstaff," Margaret mused. Declan's face brightened. "Is that a yes?" For the first time since receiving the doctor's news, Margaret felt a flutter of excitement. "Yes, let's do it." They returned to Copper Springs only long enough for Margaret to pack additional clothing and inform the mayor of her extended absence. Word of her arrangement with Declan raised eyebrows among the town's more conservative residents, but Margaret found she cared little for their opinions now. The journey to Flagstaff was more arduous than the trip to Rainbow Canyon, but Declan set a manageable pace and chose routes that avoided the worst of the terrain. Along the way, he pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his adventures as a courier. "Outlaws are a real concern," he explained as they made camp the first night. "Mail coaches get robbed regularly, but a lone rider like me isn't usually worth the trouble." "Usually?" Margaret questioned, noticing his choice of words. Declan smiled ruefully. "I've had my share of encounters. That's why I carry this." He patted the revolver holstered at his hip. "Haven't had to use it often, thankfully." "Have you ever killed anyone?" The question slipped out before Margaret could consider its propriety. If Declan was offended, he didn't show it. "Twice," he answered soberly. "Both times to protect myself and others. It's not something I'm proud of, but out here, sometimes there's no choice." Margaret nodded, understanding the harsh realities of frontier life. "Thank you for being honest." "Always will be with you," he promised, and something in his tone made her heart beat faster. They reached Flagstaff the following afternoon. The town was larger than Copper Springs, boasting a proper hotel and several established businesses. Declan insisted on getting Margaret a room at the hotel while he delivered his mail. "Meet me for dinner," he suggested. "There's a decent restaurant here, not fancy by Boston standards, but the food's good." Margaret agreed, secretly thrilled by the prospect of a proper meal and conversation that felt remarkably like courtship, though neither of them had acknowledged any romantic intentions. Alone in her hotel room, Margaret bathed and changed into her best dress, a modest blue gown that complemented her eyes. As she pinned her hair, she couldn't help but reflect on the strangeness of her situation. A week ago, she had been a respectable schoolteacher. Now she was traveling unchaperoned with a man she barely knew, facing death with a newfound determination to experience life fully. The thought of her diagnosis still brought pain, but it was duller now, tempered by Declan's influence and the beauty she had witnessed in recent days. For the first time, she truly believed it might be possible to live meaningfully in the time she had left. Declan was waiting in the hotel lobby, and Margaret nearly didn't recognize him. Gone were the dusty riding clothes, replaced by a clean shirt, vest, and trousers. His hair was combed, his face freshly shaved, and he looked undeniably handsome. "You clean up well, Mr. Samuels," she commented, taking the arm he offered, his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "As do you, Miss Fitzgerald, though you're always beautiful, if I may say so." The compliment brought color to Margaret's cheeks. "You may." The restaurant was indeed humble by Eastern standards, but the food was plentiful and well prepared. They lingered over their meal, talking about everything and nothing, books they had read, places they hoped to see, childhood memories both bitter and sweet. "I can't remember the last time I enjoyed an evening so much," Margaret confessed as they walked back to the hotel, the stars brilliant above the town. "Nor I," Declan agreed. At her door, he hesitated. "Tomorrow we head to the outlying ranches. The trails are rougher." "If you'd rather stay here, I'm coming with you," Margaret interrupted firmly. "I want to see everything I can." Declan's smile was worth any discomfort the journey might bring. "Then I'll see you at dawn." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Margaret with a strange mixture of contentment and longing. She was beginning to suspect that her feelings for the courier went beyond gratitude or friendship, but she pushed the thought aside. What future could there be for them, with her diagnosis hanging over everything? The next 2 days were a blur of new experiences as they visited isolated ranches and small settlements. Margaret met families who lived days from their nearest neighbors, women who had carved out lives of incredible resilience in the harsh landscape. Their stories inspired her, and each night she wrote in her journal, capturing impressions and emotions she hadn't expected to feel again after the doctor's news. Declan watched her writing one evening, curiosity evident in his expression. "Your stories," Margaret nodded. "Just observations, really. The people we've met, the places we've seen. I want to remember it all." "May I read them someday?" he asked softly. The question held more weight than its simple words suggested. Someday, a future beyond her immediate present. "Yes," she answered, "I'd like that." On their return journey to Copper Springs, they took a detour to a natural hot spring. Declan knew of a small, secluded pool surrounded by rock formations that provided privacy. "The water has healing properties, according to the Apache," he explained as they dismounted. "Thought it might ease your symptoms." The thoughtfulness of the gesture brought tears to Margaret's eyes. "Thank you." Declan respectfully withdrew to allow her privacy, and Margaret changed into a simple cotton shift behind the rocks before slipping into the warm water. The heat immediately soothed her aching muscles, and she closed her eyes in bliss. "All right," Declan called from a distance. "Wonderful," she answered. "You should join me at a proper distance, of course." There was a pause, then the sound of movement. A few minutes later, Declan appeared around the rock formation, wearing only his trousers rolled up to the knee. He sat at the edge of the pool, dipping his feet into the water a respectful distance from where Margaret soaked. "The Apache believe these springs connect to the spirit world," he told her, gazing at the steam rising from the water. "That they can heal not just the body but the soul." Margaret studied his profile, struck by the genuine reverence in his voice. "Do you believe that?" "I believe there's more to this world than what we can explain," he answered thoughtfully. And I've seen people find peace here when nothing else helped. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the warm water working its magic on Margaret's tired body. Eventually, she spoke again, voicing a question that had been on her mind. "Declan, why are you doing all this for me?" Truly, he didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. When he finally turned to look at her, the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. "Because from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach last year, looking so determined and brave, I haven't been able to get you out of my mind," he admitted. "I volunteered for the Copper Springs mail route just to have a reason to see you. Pathetic, I know." Margaret was stunned by the confession. "You never said anything?" "What was I supposed to say? 'Good morning, Miss Fitzgerald. I deliver your mail and I'm hopelessly smitten with you.'" He shook his head, a rueful smile on his lips. "You were the educated schoolteacher from Boston." "I'm just a courier with dirt under his fingernails." "That's not how I see you at all," Margaret protested, moving slightly closer in the water. "You're the most interesting, knowledgeable man I've ever known." Declan's eyes darkened with emotion. "And now that I finally have the courage to tell you he broke off, unable to say the words. "Dying," Margaret finished for him, her voice steady despite the pain in her heart. "I'm dying, Declan, which is why this whatever is happening between us can't go anywhere." "Why not?" he challenged, sliding into the water fully clothed and moving toward her. "Why can't we have what time there is?" Margaret backed away slightly, conscious of her thin shift and the intensity in his eyes. "Because it would only lead to more pain for both of us." "I'm willing to risk it," Declan said, stopping a respectable distance from her but close enough that she could see the sincerity in his expression. "Are you?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications. Margaret's mind raced with objections, propriety, practicality, the inevitability of heartbreak, but her heart had already decided. "Yes," she whispered. "God help me, yes." Declan moved slowly, giving her every chance to change her mind until he was close enough to cup her face in his hands. His touch was gentle, reverent, as he leaned in to place a soft kiss on her lips. The contact was brief but electric, sending a current of feeling through Margaret that made her diagnosis, her fears, everything else recede into insignificance. When they broke apart, she saw her own wonder reflected in Declan's eyes. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I met you," he confessed. Margaret smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I wish you hadn't waited so long." They returned to Copper Springs the next day, both changed by the confession of their feelings but uncertain of what came next. Margaret resumed her teaching duties, finding new joy in her students' progress, despite knowing she wouldn't see their education through. Declan continued his mail routes but arranged his schedule to spend more time in town. They were discreet at first, meeting for walks or quiet dinners at Margaret's cabin, mindful of the town's propensity for gossip. But as weeks passed and Margaret's condition began to show more visible signs, increased fatigue, a persistent cough that sometimes brought up blood, they grew less concerned with appearances. "Let them talk," Declan said one evening when Margaret expressed concern about being seen leaving the general store on his arm. "We have nothing to be ashamed of." "It's not shame," she clarified. "I just don't want your reputation tarnished when I'm don't," he interrupted gently. "Don't talk as if you're already gone." Margaret nodded, understanding his need to focus on the present, yet she couldn't help preparing for the inevitable. She began organizing her modest affairs, writing letters to former students and colleagues back east, and most importantly, working on her stories. "These are wonderful," Declan told her one night after reading her latest writings, vivid accounts of their travels and the people they'd met, interspersed with her own reflections on life and love. "You should publish them." Who would publish the scribblings of an unknown schoolteacher? She asked with a self-deprecating smile. "I know a man in San Francisco who prints books and pamphlets. I could send him your work." The suggestion kindled a spark of hope in Margaret, the possibility that something of her might live on after she was gone. "Would you, truly?" "I'll take them myself on my next run west," Declan promised, sealing his words with a kiss that had become as necessary as breathing to both of them. As summer faded into autumn, Margaret's health declined more rapidly than expected. The doctor in Copper Springs could offer little beyond laudanum for pain, and the suggestion that she stop teaching to conserve her strength. Declan, witnessing her deterioration, grew increasingly desperate for solutions. "There's a specialist in Denver," he told her one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset. "A doctor who's had success treating consumption with new methods." Margaret shook her head, having accepted her fate. "Declan, we both know no," he said firmly. "I'm not giving up. Not when there's any chance at all." His determination wore down her resistance, and a week later they boarded the train to Denver, a luxury Margaret had never expected to experience again. The journey was difficult. The train's soot and smoke aggravated her condition, and she spent much of the trip fighting for breath between coughing spells. Declan never left her side, supporting her physically and emotionally with a tenderness that brought tears to the eyes of fellow passengers who witnessed their devotion. Denver was a shock after the relative quiet of Copper Springs, a bustling city with paved streets, electric lights in some buildings, and a population that moved at a pace Margaret found dizzying. Dr. Harrison Whitfield's clinic occupied a stately building near the center of town, its waiting room filled with patients in various stages of respiratory distress. "He's pioneering a treatment involving controlled exposure to pine vapors and a specific dietary regimen," Declan explained as they waited. He had clearly researched extensively. "There have been documented recoveries." Margaret squeezed his hand, loving him for his hope while managing her own expectations. When they were finally shown into the doctor's consultation room, she was surprised by the man's youth and the compassion in his eyes as he examined her. "The disease has advanced considerably, Doctor," Whitfield told them after listening to her lungs and reviewing her symptoms. "But I've seen patients recover from worse." "What would the treatment involve?" Declan asked eagerly. "Miss Fitzgerald would need to remain in Denver under my care for at least 3 months. The regimen is rigorous specific breathing exercises, dietary restrictions, and regular exposure to the therapeutic environment in my sanatorium." 3 months, Margaret repeated, calculating mentally. According to her original diagnosis, that would leave her with only 3 months afterward, assuming the treatment worked. "The cost is substantial," Dr. Whitfield continued, naming a figure that made Margaret's heart sink. It was more than she had saved in her entire teaching career. "We'll find a way," Declan said without hesitation. "When can she start?" Outside the clinic, Margaret turned to Declan with concern. "The cost doesn't matter," he interrupted firmly. "I have savings, and if it's not enough, I'll find more work." "Declan, I can't let you're not letting me do anything," he said, taking her hands in his. "I'm choosing this, I'm choosing you." "But what if it doesn't work?" Margaret voiced her deepest fear. "What if we spend everything and then we'll have tried," Declan said simply. "And we'll still have whatever time is left to live as fully as possible." His unwavering determination broke through the last of Margaret's resistance. "All right," she agreed, "we'll try." The next day, Margaret moved into the sanatorium, a airy building on the outskirts of Denver, where patients spent their days following Dr. Whitfield's regimen. The routine was demanding. Specific breathing exercises at dawn, carefully measured meals of fresh vegetables and lean meats, hours spent in a pine-scented room where attendants monitored every patient's progress. Declan found work at a local livery stable and rented a small room nearby, visiting Margaret every day when the sanatorium permitted. He brought her books, fresh flowers, and most precious of all, news that the publisher in San Francisco was interested in her stories. "He wants to print them as a collection," Declan told her excitedly during one visit. "Said they capture the spirit of the West in a way he hasn't seen before." The news brought color to Margaret's pale cheeks. "Truly, it's not just kindness because of my condition." "He doesn't know about your condition," Declan assured her. "He's offering an advance, not much, but something, and royalties if the book sells well." For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a future, her name on a book, her words reaching people she would never meet. It gave her a reason to push through the difficult days when breathing was painful and the treatment seemed futile. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, her condition began to improve. The coughing fits became less frequent, her appetite returned, and Dr. Whitfield noted with cautious optimism that the sounds in her lungs were clearing. "The treatment is working," he told them at the 2-month mark. "Not a cure, mind you, consumption is never truly cured, but a remission is possible." With continued care, Miss Fitzgerald could live for years rather than months. The news was too overwhelming to absorb immediately. Margaret and Declan sat in stunned silence after the doctor left them alone to process his words. "Years," Declan finally said, his voice breaking on the word. "Margaret, do you understand what this means?" "It means we have a future," she whispered, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "A real future." Declan pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. "Marry me," he said against her hair. "As soon as you're strong enough, marry me." Margaret pulled back to see his face, to confirm that this wasn't simply joy overriding reason. What she saw was love, pure, unwavering love that had sustained them both through the darkest months of her illness. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you." They were wed in a small ceremony in Denver 3 weeks later, with Dr. Whitfield and a few friends from the sanatorium as witnesses. Margaret wore a simple cream dress, her hair adorned with wildflowers Declan had collected from the hills outside the city. Though still thin and occasionally weak, she stood tall beside the man who had refused to let her give up on life. The publisher from San Francisco sent a special delivery on their wedding day, the first printed copy of Western Horizons, Stories of Frontier Life by Margaret Fitzgerald. Seeing her name in print brought fresh tears to Margaret's eyes, and Declan's pride was evident as he showed the book to everyone at their modest celebration. "What do we do now?" Margaret asked that evening as they stood on the small balcony of the hotel room Declan had splurged on for their wedding night. "Whatever we want," he answered, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "The doctor says you need to continue the treatments for another few months, but after that, we could go back to Copper Springs or try somewhere new, San Francisco maybe, to be closer to your publisher." "Would you mind leaving the courier routes?" Margaret asked, concerned about asking him to give up the freedom he cherished. Declan turned her to face him. "The routes were just a way to see the country and to see you. All that matters is that we're together." "I want to see more of the country," Margaret decided, "with you, and I want to write about it all." "Then that's what we'll do," Declan promised, sealing their future with a kiss that held all the promise of their unexpected second chance. In the spring of 1880, Margaret and Declan Samuels left Denver with Dr. Whitfield's blessing and a supply of pine extract that Margaret was to continue using. Their first stop was Copper Springs, where Margaret formally resigned her teaching position and collected the belongings they had left behind. The town that had witnessed her darkest days now celebrated her recovery and marriage, with even the strictest citizens acknowledging the devotion Declan had shown during her illness. From Arizona, they traveled west, eventually reaching San Francisco, where Margaret met her publisher and signed a contract for a second book, this one about her journey through consumption and recovery. The book, titled Borrowed Time, would go on to bring comfort to countless others facing similar diagnoses. They didn't settle permanently anywhere for several years, instead choosing to explore the changing West as it transitioned from frontier to established civilization. Margaret's health remained stable with careful management, though winter months in cold regions would always bring a recurrence of symptoms that required vigilance. In 1885, they finally purchased land near Santa Barbara, California, where the mild climate proved beneficial to Margaret's health, and the growing community welcomed Declan's skills as a horseman and guide. They built a modest ranch house with wide porches and large windows that let in abundant light and air, key components of Margaret's ongoing treatment. It was there, under the shade of a massive oak tree, that Margaret wrote her most successful work, yet a novel about a schoolteacher who finds love and purpose in the Arizona territory despite seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The book's publication in 1887 established her as one of the West's authentic literary voices and provided financial security they had never imagined possible. That same year brought their greatest joy the birth of their daughter, Emma, something doctors had warned might never be possible given Margaret's condition. The girl inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's adventurous spirit, growing up surrounded by books and horses and endless stories of the frontier. On Margaret's 30th birthday, a milestone she had once believed she would never reach, Declan surprised her with a journal he had kept during her illness, documenting not just her struggle but his own feelings throughout the ordeal. "I want you to have this," he told her as they sat together on their porch, watching Emma play in the garden with the puppy they had recently adopted. "To remember how far we've come." Margaret turned the pages slowly, reading Declan's honest, sometimes raw accounts of those desperate days. One entry in particular caught her attention, written the day after the doctor in Copper Springs had delivered her diagnosis. "She couldn't stop crying after the doctor's news," Declan had written. "I told her we'll live the life we still can. I didn't know then what that would mean, only that I couldn't bear to see her give up. Now I understand it was a promise not just to make the most of her remaining days, but to fight for more days, more life, more love. I will keep fighting, no matter what comes." Margaret closed the journal and leaned into her husband's embrace, overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built from what was meant to be an ending. "I love you," she whispered, the words inadequate for the depth of her feeling but all she had to offer. Declan's arms tightened around her. "And I love you, always have, always will." As the California sun set before them, painting the sky in colors that rivaled Rainbow Canyon, Margaret reflected on how a diagnosis meant to be a death sentence had instead become the beginning of a life richer than she could have imagined. With Declan beside her and their daughter's laughter filling the air, she knew with absolute certainty that whatever time they had together, whether months or years or decades, would be fully, completely lived. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for, not the quantity of days, but the quality of the life contained within them. The life they still could and would continue to live.